So today I'd like to talk about something that is very important to me, and that is remembering what I read. And before I get into what I do to remember what I read, I want to tell you a story about why this topic is so important to me. So back in January of 2020, that's when I was seriously getting into reading. That's when I'd read Frankenstein. That's when I had sort of kindled this passion for the classics and reading more books. And so from January 2020 onwards, I was reading pretty feverishly. I was constantly having a book at my side, reading every day. And it was during this time period where I realized like how many books were out there and how many I wanted to read, but there's so little time. The classic book fanatic dilemma, basically. So many books, so little time. And so upon this realization that I was pressed for time for reading all these books, I adopted this silly notion in my head of I need to read as fast as possible so I can get to the next book. So this was my mentality in regards to reading during this time period. So fast forward a little bit to April of 2020, like about exactly a year ago. I read the book Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. Uh, and when I read it at the time, I loved it. I thought it was a fantastic book. I read it in about 4 days, which was kind of intense because the book's about 500 pages, and uh, I went through it pretty quickly. And it's a nonfiction book. It's dense with facts and history, and so my approach to the book was I'll just read through this. I'll just read it and I'll just get through it, get to the next book. Soon after, I realized that's no way of approaching a nonfiction book. But anyway, it wasn't until July of 2020 when I had this realization that I had been approaching my reading wrong. You see, I randomly had this thought one day, just randomly. I was just doing something, maybe like folding laundry or something. And I thought to myself, I read Sapiens back in April, but I barely remember anything that I read. I remembered the broad strokes of the book, like the main thesis points or the historical facts, the way the book was divided up. But the minutia, the concluding points that the author made, I could not recall it. And this is only a few months after reading it, and I realized, oh my god, it's like as if I never even read the book. If I can't remember any of this, I might as well have just read it like a Spark Notes summary of the book instead of just buying the book and reading it and then forgetting it. And so this was a pretty scary moment for me because I realized all these books I'd been reading up until that point in the year were sort of just washing over me. Another example, I read Don Quixote. I think actually before Sapiens. So this is like March, early April. So I read Don Quixote. That's 1,000 pages. That's one of the greatest books ever written. And I also had this approach to that book where I just read it. I just read it as fast as possible. And I still have very fond memories of reading Don Quixote a year ago. But I think a lot of the book was lost on me because I had this notion of just get through it as fast as possible. I know I've said that several times now, but when I had the realization that all these books had washed over me, I was completely mortified. So now it's the end of July 2020. I've had the realization that I've been reading the incorrect way, and I needed to fix things. I need to remember what I read. So one of the first things I did, one thing that was suggested to me by somebody was to download the app Notion, which is like a sort of not I don't think productivity is the right word for it, but it's like a note taking app, but it also has many other capabilities. And so I tried that for a little bit. I was reading some nonfiction books. I was typing in into my Notion account what particularly resonated with me and what have you. But it didn't work for me. I'm someone who gets distracted easily, and so when I'm on my laptop typing up notes from the book I'm reading, I just the temptation to like check my email or go on the internet is very strong. And so I abandoned any note taking apps or any of that sort for my reading. So what I eventually turned to was getting a journal. And in August, I sort of got into this habit of if I'm reading something and I read something that really resonated with me um, in fiction, mostly fiction, not nonfiction, but in fiction, if there's like a paragraph where I was just like, wow, that is thought provoking, or that is a beautiful sentence, or anything of that sort, I would write it down in here, in this journal, and I'd put it in quotation marks. I would write down the quote verbatim, and then I would timestamp it. I said I wrote this August 14th at 9:46 p.m. And then underneath the quote that I've written, I would write down my notes. I would like ask myself, why did I write down this quote? Why in this moment do I feel the need to write this quote down in this book? That was sort of a method that helped me retain more what I was reading in regards to fiction. Mind you, I was also I was using these little post-it notes to mark specific passages that when I was finished reading the book, I would reflect on and return to the post-it notes. So, for example, I'm reading The Red and the Black by Stendhal right now, and I'm really having a fun time. As you can see, there's a lot of post-it notes in there. These passages that I've marked up are either like specific character development moments that are important to the plot that I should remember and reflect on when I finish the book, specific phrases that wowed me, or interesting moments or brilliant uses of prose, stuff like that. Just anything that makes me stop when I'm reading and I stop and go, oh wow, that is good. I'll pull this out and I'll just take one at random and I'll mark up the passage. I don't write anything. I just mark it up. And I know there's several different colors here. I don't color code these. These don't none of these colors particularly pertain to a certain thing in a book. Like yellow means good dialogue, green means plot point. I don't do that. I just mark it up with the post-it notes. But when it comes to nonfiction, I take it up a notch. I have a pencil in hand and I go at it. So I just want to briefly show you what my notes look like for Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human by Harold Bloom, and how I sort of mark up a text. And what I'm basically doing when I'm reading is underlining things that seem to be important or critical to the thesis, writing notes to myself, and pointing out things that I find particularly interesting, arguing with Bloom and saying like, do I agree with this statement, or do I not agree with it? You know, stuff like that. So this is just to show you what exactly my marking up looks like. This is for nonfiction. And so yeah, this is basically how I go about doing this. And all this marking up, this is I think about 60 pages worth of it. This took me about four days ish. So about an hour and a half each day of just going at this. And it's so much fun doing this. I can't advocate it enough. You really learn a lot by doing this. So yeah, that's just basically how I go about doing it. So yeah, those are the strategies I sort of take to remember fiction and nonfiction. And so what I would like to say at the end of this video is don't force yourself to read super fast. I am a big proponent of forcing yourself to read just a little bit slower, whatever your reading pace is. Just read a little bit slower and just try and really understand what you're reading. So if you're reading nonfiction, don't let things that that get lost on you, don't glaze over that stuff. Like really try and stop and understand. If you really like the book, stop and understand and make sure, collect yourself before you go to the next chapter or the next big point in the book. Have this sort of interactive relationship with the book where, like, let's say if you're reading nonfiction, you're writing up and down the margins, arguing with the author, circling things that you either agree or disagree with, stuff like that. Just make it a little more interactive. And I promise you, you will remember a lot more. The Hamlet chapter in this book that I've shown you, that I marked up, I did all that work in January, so it's April now, so a few months ago. What I remember pretty much everything in this chapter. Like right off the top of my head, I remember it. And that's because over the course of 4 days, I went through the 60 pages in the chapter. So remember, Sapiens, that book a year ago that I read the entire book, 500 pages, in 4 days. This Hamlet chapter in this book, that's just 60 pages, I took 4 days to get through that. And I remember so much more because I slowed down and I really thought to myself, what is the author trying to say? And do I agree with it? And if I don't agree with it, why don't I agree with it? What specifically in the argument do I not agree with? And by doing this, you remember so much more. And it's also a much more rewarding experience. And then in regards to fiction, I would highly suggest writing down in the books that you read, writing down passages that really resonate with you, and then talk about it. But like, don't do it for like social media or anything. Do it in a journal or do it in a note taking app if that's what you prefer. Take those passages that really speak to you, where you read a book and you go, "That's me." Take that passage, write it down somewhere, and just write yourself a note and just say, "Hey, future me, I'm writing this down now because this really speaks to me for this reason." And then a couple weeks, months, years down the line, you can return to that journal entry or whatever and reflect on that and say, "Wow, this is what I was feeling in this particular moment." And so those are just the suggestions that I have to not only help you remember what you read, but also have a more rewarding reading experience, because I can tell you that my passion for reading has multiplied tenfold because of these new tactics that I've employed. So what I'm encouraging you to do is in your reading, just push yourself just a little bit to really understand what you're reading. But make sure you're having fun. It's very important that you're having fun and you're enjoying yourself. But that doesn't mean you can't push yourself, because you'll find that in doing so, you'll surprise yourself in what you're capable of. And so yeah, that's all I have today. Again, this is a really important topic to me. I really am a firm proponent of slow, deep reading, remembering what you read, making sure you're having fun while you're doing it too. So yeah, that's the video today. It's a very important topic for me, and I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. Let me know what tactics you use to remember what you read, what specifically works for you that I didn't mention or you think would work for me. So yeah, I'll see you in the next one.